Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Leonie Kronborg. I'm one of the executive members of the World Council for Gifted Education. I'm here this afternoon to introduce our next keynote speaker, Roland Pearson. He is the Professor of Educational Psychology from Jönköping University in Sweden. Would you please join me in welcoming him this afternoon to give his keynote? Thank you.
Hello everyone, and thank you for coming to this keynote. And I'd like to extend my thanks also to the committee of the conference who invited me to do this. And I aim to challenge you a bit. We'll see what happens afterwards, if I challenge you too much maybe. We'll see. For this keynote, I will embark on a complex and somewhat unusual task. I will attempt to explain who, rather than what, decides what giftedness is. While the lacking consensus on definitions in gifted education has been addressed formidably by several learned colleagues, still lacking in theory, research, and in the general discourse of things, is an interest in the dynamics and impact of social context. Also, theory, research tend to be generated in a conspicuous isolation. We are well aware of the facts and ambitions of our own chosen disciplines, but academics within these disciplines are often quite unaware or even uninterested in the facts and ambitions of other disciplines, even though these may be similar, complementary, and could offer the solution to certain research dilemmas. Arising from such relative isolation is a void of understanding for the social dynamics by which labels, values, and theory in science are generated. You might argue, for example, that giftedness is entirely defined by scientific effort and hard-working objective researchers, ever keen on making progress and new discoveries. While this is perhaps how it ought to be, you must also consider what is a scientific effort and what motivates scientists to say what they say and do what they do. This is by no means as straightforward as one might think. I need only, as an example, mention the numbers of fraud and dishonesty in research, increasing in direct proportion to the also increasing degree of industrialization and political control of the world of research. The history, sociology, and psychology of science are domains of study that a majority of researchers rarely or never acquaint themselves with. My aim with this keynote address, therefore, is to provide a context to the understanding of giftedness and gifted education in a way that will hopefully facilitate their further development and provide a sustainable and more realistic understanding of these. I will focus on the following three issues, as you can see on the screen. First, why are we at all mindful of the gifted? Which are the driving forces behind our interest? And second, I will address the problem of dogma and conflict, as well as of the denial of human nature. Human behavior is relying on much more than the psychometric states and traits constituting so much of the basis of our current understanding of giftedness and talent. Thirdly, and also concluding this keynote, I will address a few aspects of culture in regard to the current and future state of gifted education. So, why are we at all pursuing an understanding of giftedness, talent, and its education? Well, there appear to exist a few main reasons. In a global perspective, I think that there is also emerging a priority amongst these. Increasingly important is the potential contribution of the gifted and talented to the global economy, which is why policymakers and the leaders of business and finance express a growing interest in gifted education and its various formats. However, the world of business tends to pursue talent recruitment and training separate from national education systems. The gifted and talented are often also discussed as problem solvers in the interest of national welfare and of the hoped-for development and economic success of individual nations. The least prioritized motive is surprisingly the individual needs and wants of the gifted and talented themselves. I have found that this is and continues to be that which primarily motivates educators and parents. The gifted have been described as, and I give you a few quotes from the literature, the world's ultimate capital asset, and also that they guarantee a constant reservoir of individuals who will lead both research and development and education, thus continuing to propel recruitment of the community, the state, and humanity at large toward a knowledge-based economy. In Korea, for example, creativity has come to the forefront in considering Korea's future in the global economy. The same is true of Azerbaijan, and of course true also in Europe and in the United States. Policymakers are urged to meet the needs of intellectually precocious youth because they represent extraordinary human capital for society at large. The idea that education serves the purpose of individual enlightenment and empowerment is increasingly overshadowed by the global knowledge economy's demand for growth by innovation, that is, discovery of new marketable products and services by high-achieving, gifted and talented individuals. According to the World Bank, and I quote them, "Only educational spending that is immediately profitable is justifiable, and studies such as in anthropology and cultural studies are irrelevant." For this reason, according to some scholars, we need to persuade policymakers of the desirability of gifted education programs and services and to improve our communication regarding the prospective and actual benefits of gifted education. The world really does need problem solvers in view of recent years' global problems and crises, from shattered economies to environmental disasters and the emergence of an increasingly fickle climate for the entire planet. Who are better equipped to assist than the gifted and the talented? However, consider what Joan Freeman has argued, namely that the gifted need permission to be gifted. This is a most important aspect of the hopes and efforts we tend to invest into the pursuit of gifted education. The World Economic Forum has recently published a report on global risks, which you can see on the screens, problems that we may all encounter, irrespective of in which country we live. These are, for example, severe income disparity, chronic fiscal imbalances, rising greenhouse gas emissions, water supply crises, and mismanagement of population aging. The report rates these critical issues in terms of how likely it is that they can be avoided or in fact are already happening. They all rate, according to this report, as almost certain. Also quite recently, the rather unique Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University published an equally alarming report on threats to the survival of the human species, which immediately caught the interest of the press and media. The researchers of the Institute point out that humanity has indeed had a knack for surviving every cataclysmic and threatening calamity over time thus far. But during the last few decades or so, there have developed threats for which there are no track records of surviving, namely synthetic biology, nanotechnology, machine intelligence, computer algorithms controlling the stock market, and the manipulation of genetic structure. Note that the problems are not the innovations as such, but rather the question of human error, or indeed terror. The head of the Institute, Dr. Nick Bostrom, he explains to the BBC, and I quote from the BBC interview, "We are at the level of infants in moral responsibility. But with technical capability of adults, the advance of technology has overtaken our capacity to control the possible consequences. End of quote. Apart from the obvious question, this doesn't work, there it is. Apart from the obvious question, why, as a global community, do we not take appropriate action immediately to make certain that things do not go out of hand? It is also the question, how great an interest does the scientific community actually have in focusing on human survival as a research problem? Bostrom again, he compares the number of published scholarly articles on 3 randomly chosen research topics, plus studies focusing on human extinction, all published in 2012. He found that there were approximately 1,000 studies on dung beetles, about 600 on snowboarding, 100 on the chemical compound of zinc oxalate, and only a handful of published papers were devoted to human extinction. Apparently, the interest to study and ponder the survival of humankind carries little weight in the scientific community. A fair guess of why this imbalance of priorities exists is that there is no or little research funding available to study something that does not immediately support economic growth. It is therefore also unlikely that such study would fast-track any scholar to a distinguished academic career, and for this reason be of limited interest. Most of you will know the UNESCO Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action on Special Needs from 1994. It speaks compassionately and very reasonably on the individual needs and rights of every child. And I'll quote from it. Every child has a fundamental right to education and must be given the opportunity to achieve and maintain an acceptable level of learning. Every child has unique characteristics, interests, abilities, and learning needs. Education systems should be designed and educational programs implemented to take into account the wide variety of these characteristics and needs, end of quote. Well, with the emerging global knowledge economy, there has been a rapid shift of emphasis in many school systems worldwide from an individual right to education, satisfying individual children's needs, to school systems mainly producing quality manpower, capable of developing and sustaining a knowledge economy. In the wake of this shift, the OECD program for international student assessments, you know it as PISA, was launched in the year 2000, to date involving about 70 countries worldwide, aiming to evaluate education systems by testing students' abilities in reading, mathematics, and science every 3 years or so. The testing program is, above all, a political program, a political instrument, economic in nature. It has very little or nothing to do with the needs and interests of individual students. By and large, I think that educators currently experience the impact of the changing motives for education, but most have probably not reflected why and by what structural means these changes are taking place. As policies of education are in the process of changing, therefore, a majority of educators would still tend to prioritize children's individual needs. So much so, in fact, that educators are encouraged to increasingly emphasize the economic benefits of their work when interacting with policymakers to be listened to. We want the gifted and talented for their potential input into the global economy, certainly. Their ability to resolve difficult problems, potentially threatening the welfare of humanity, and of course, because they have educational needs and individual interests that need to be met. This all seems quite straightforward and uncomplicated, doesn't it? Well, why does gifted education have problems with theory, with implementation, and even with worldwide recognition? Only about 17% of the world's countries pursue some type of systematic educational intervention for gifted and talented children. I propose that there are two main reasons for these problems. The first one is dogmatism, and the second, the frequent failure of much of the academic world to recognize human nature and taking it into account in research and application. Dogmatism is often defined as, and I quote Borland's definition and elaboration of the original Milton Rokeach construct, a closed mind characterized by a stubborn refusal to acknowledge truth, a willful irrationality within a context in which rationality is a valid criterion for assessing the soundness of one's thinking. Human nature, on the other hand, tends to refer to the distinguishing characteristics, including ways of thinking, feeling, and acting, that humans tend to have naturally, independently of the influence of culture. In other words, these are adaptive aspects of human behavior, not necessarily subject to a learning process. Dogmatism must not only be understood as a psychological construct, designating certain individuals' disposition. It is also a defense mechanism, protecting self and everything that constitutes identity. In consequence, dogmatism can be understood not only as maladaptive, but quite the contrary. It could just as well be the result of adaptation to their expectations and demands of any social context. Therefore, dogmatism may certainly promote coping and helps survival in a certain social environment. The history of science, and I'm sure you agree, is not one always characterized by humility. A number of scientists through history have argued that their contributions to science were nothing short of the ultimate discovery, after which few worthwhile further discoveries could ever be made. Nobel Prize laureate Albert Michelson, for example, in 1888, he proudly stated that, in physics, the more fundamental laws and facts of physical science have all been discovered. Well, but after his demise, quantum physics arrived. Einstein's theory of relativity was proposed. Nuclear fission was discovered. And we learned that there were billions of galaxies beyond our own spiral galaxy, the Milky Way. Apparently, there was more to learn after Albert Michelson. Well, in the social sciences, it has been much the same. Well known and surprisingly still often quoted is the rather audacious statement of behaviorist John B. Watson that any end is possible given the right upbringing of children. Equally astounding is the insistence on non-essentialism by social constructivists. This tenet precludes the influence of genes and hormones on human behavior. However, we have learned through discoveries in other disciplines such as genetics and physiology that all things are not possible, irrespective of how stupendous an environment for bringing up children is. Also, human behavior is most certainly swayed by physiological factors, even down to the choice of a life partner, if such a choice happens to be part of the culture. The scientific community, then, often speaks of and enthusiastically envisions almost unbridled progress and development. But it surprisingly often acts as if knowledge was absolute, static, and new discoveries were in fact uninteresting. Now, Robert Sternberg has quite recently and very succinctly pointed out that the knowledge and research constituting the foundations for gifted education is in fact also largely static. It has changed surprisingly little over time. He has suggested three main reasons for this. Firstly, the urgent societal need for real-world practice in education, particularly the Western world, has little patience to wait for what stringent and time-consuming research processes have to suggest. Second, the accountability movement, insisting on the pursuit of quality, I'm sure you know the concept, through business models on every aspect of work in education and their means of control, which tend to be insensitive to human abilities and individual needs. And third, budgets, the shortage of money for particular programs and research. These are usually dependent on political will, as well as of the ideological recognition of the field, which naturally varies around the world. So these reasons, they are more or less the result of neoliberal ideology, by which education is currently motivated and transformed to better fit a global knowledge economy. However, there are further likely reasons why our understanding of giftedness and its education have progressed very little over a long period of time. We have narrow understandings of giftedness with a bias toward the analytical and its testing. We are usually also unaware of the impact of cognitive conservatism and familiarity. That is, we tend not to like change, not even if necessary in light of research evidence. And finally, we are similarly unaware of a variety of personality traits, stereotypes, and group behaviors as prompted by human nature. The latter three are all due to dogmatism and to the very tangible but usually ignored influence of human nature. Our refusal to acknowledge human nature, Harvard University's Steven Pinker has argued, and I quote him, is like the Victorians' embarrassment about sex, only worse. It distorts our science and scholarship, our public discourse, and our day-to-day lives. The dogma that human nature does not exist in the face of evidence that from science and common sense that it actually does is a corrupting influence, end of quote. Furthermore, we often speak enthusiastically of academic freedom. It is often argued to be the basis of all higher education and research. But the academic world has, in spite of such an age-old ideal, never been entirely free to think, to say, to write, or study everything in pursuit of personal convictions and interests. The academic world, for good and for worse, has been ruled not necessarily always by external political influence, but by internal and dominant knowledge monopolies who decide the definitions of truth and their suitability. More importantly, such monopolies tend also to suppress new ways of thinking. But we need to consider also that these monopolies are usually, they have political sanction and tend to be motivated by gain, power, and influence rather than by epistemological conviction, empirical discovery, objectivity, and accuracy. Now, Henry Bauer, from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, he has studied such current knowledge monopolies. For example, astronomy. In astronomy, everyone must accept the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe. If not, there is an influential group of about 510 astronomers to date, worldwide, insisting that such an alternative research must not be funded, nor should proponents of an alternative theory even be allowed a mainstream public forum to be heard. In medicine, scholars must embrace the assumption that HIV, for example, is always the cause of AIDS. Scientists who argue otherwise will find it difficult to be taken seriously, and they can certainly expect rejection when submitting manuscripts to the most famous journals. And a group of about 2,600 researchers and others stand behind this normative single explanation, insisting on the causality of HIV. In studying climate change, it's the same. To retain credibility, the continued support of political leaderships, one usually needs to accept the dominant position, that the climate is changing and that this change is caused mainly by human intervention. I would like to add another monopoly to these, namely how giftedness is understood in various parts of the world. Which of the following two is the more politically correct one? A, To understand giftedness as normally distributed and therefore constituting an attribute of a small group in any population, or B, to understand giftedness as a possibility for everyone in any population, given that school systems and their teachers are sufficiently trained and knowledgeable. My observation, at least, is that in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe, it is politically very difficult to discuss giftedness as exclusive to only a few. The issue of labels is generally avoided, but if used, the term talent is preferred, and it signifies a potential development for each and every one. It matters little whether the underlying assumption is scientifically right or wrong. The similarity and equality of each member of society is ideologically enforced. Contrary views are discouraged, ignored, and sometimes even ridiculed. Arguing talent for all is acceptable, condoned, and rewarded, whereas arguing giftedness for a few is, as a rule, not an option for any career-minded scholar in need of political support and research funding. They certainly are very earnest and honest scientists, generating well-considered research and theory, making new discoveries, but with differing views on the origins of the universe, of the underlying causes of AIDS, on the reasons for climate change, and the understanding of giftedness in society. As a result of their politically incorrect stance, they tend to be ignored, marginalized, and sometimes even stigmatized by the dominant knowledge monopolies and by everyone with a vested interest in retaining a monopoly unchanged. There are unavoidable forces, both internal and external to universities, motivating each academic, for good and for worse, to conform to a variety of canons. Learning from history as we pursue research and meet colleagues with ideas that we do not yet understand or accept, we need to consider the fact that there is a significant probability that some of today's heresies will become tomorrow the future's mainstream consensus. One of the more famous examples, as you can see on the screen, is Italian astronomer Galileo Galilei. He was summoned to the Roman Inquisition in 1632 for being, and I quote, vehemently suspect of heresy. He had argued that the sun lies motionless at the center of the universe, an undisputed fact in every book on astronomy today, but in the 17th century, it was contrary to the official Roman Catholic policy, and therefore unacceptable. For this suggestion, Galileo was sentenced to house arrest lasting his entire life. My point is that we tend to forget that the same forces imprisoning Galilei are alive and well. They are still reacting to deviance from academic and societal canons, and for the very same reasons. Allow me to quote at length Robert Quinn, heading the Scholars at Risk Network, based at New York University. He has pointed out that, and I quote him, evidence suggests that academic communities remained favorite targets for repression. In the information age, the scholar's role in shaping the quality and flow of information in society is an unquestionable source of power. Repressive authorities intent on controlling societies naturally seek to control that power. Scholars are obstacles to these goals because the nature of their work requires the development of ideas, exchange of information, and expression of new opinions. Where the ideas and information and opinions are perceived by authorities as threatening, individual scholars are particularly vulnerable. Such scholars are labeled explicitly or implicitly, and I quote, dangerous suspect, disloyal, dissident, or enemy of the state, society, faith, family, culture, and so on. It is important, I think, to recognize that repression here must not be understood as referring to any specific country. Repression of information or knowledge, contrary to dominant knowledge monopolies, is universal. Only the means and the degree of ferocity by which such repression is pursued differ. All nations do this, no matter how democratic, and they have always done it, prompted by human nature. Dogmatism should be understood as the impact of dominance behavior through aggression, especially the defense and conquest of territory, the assertion of dominance within well-organized groups, and as the disciplinary action used to enforce implicit and explicit rules of any group. Aggression is unavoidably part of human nature and has biological determinants. We are programmed by evolution to defend our interests for as long as they somehow serve our survival. Perceived threats are handled by humans and other animals, social animals I should say, alike by posturing, submission, escape, and attack and elimination. Our first choice is generally not to eliminate the threat posed by another individual. It is to scare them off by demonstrating superiority. If this proves successful and whoever threatened us is convinced of the opposing greater strength, he or she may choose to simply leave to seek safety elsewhere. However, the threatening individual may escort to forming liaisons instead. It is better to be friend and ally to perceived superiority rather than to be its foe. As a last resort, if nothing else works, we address the perceived problem with an intention of eliminating it once and for all. In the light of dogmatism and dominant knowledge monopolies, it is prudent, I think, to consider the degree of submission and adaptation necessary to fit into any social group ruled by the dynamics imposed on all social animals by evolution, and compare with the typical characteristics of gifted behavior. Ellen Winner, for example, she has portrayed the gifted as, and I quote from her book, risk-takers with a desire to shake things up. Most of all, they have the desire to set things straight, to alter the status quo and shake up established tradition. Creators do not accept the prevailing view. They are oppositional and discontented, end of quote. Also, researchers Janus and Robinson have summarized the known characteristics of intellectually gifted individuals as self-sufficient, independent, autonomous, dominant, and individual, self-directed, intellectually curious, reflective, creative, imaginative, and listen to this, non-conformist. Given that these studies of gifted personality are reasonably correct for a majority of gifted individuals, although perhaps not all, it raises a most important question in the light of why we are interested in promoting the gifted and talented. How feasible is it to expect the gifted to contribute to the global economy, to be the warrants for any nation's future welfare and wealth, and if need be, perhaps also serve the world as saviors of the human prospect? Reaching a place of influence and trust in any society, the gifted, like everyone else, first have to adapt, conform, and prove loyal to the many existing canons and dominant knowledge monopolies and their influential leaders. Their allegiance must also be proven and rewarded. This means that they often have to compromise their own identity, their personal values, and the way in which they tend to function without socially imposed restrictions. I have myself encountered enough a number of highly able individuals in a variety of walks of life to know that making such compromise is an almost insurmountable challenge to them. It is almost always tied to conflicts, self-doubt, frustration, and over time to alienation and clinical depression. I would like to make a bold proposal at this stage, namely that the gifted seem often to have the means to override their human nature. Being aware of it, they may decide to act contrary to the human nature and not necessarily follow their own instincts, as it were. They often refuse to accept that which does not conform to their own logic, conviction, or insight. Since their conclusions rarely coincide with those of the dominant knowledge monopolies, conflict with their immediate social context arises and becomes a problem to continued employment or cooperation. As a result, the gifted individual becomes regarded as a difficult troublemaker, threatening both social cohesion and perceived competence and standing of individual leaders. Note that difficulties such as these are also what research into the work satisfaction of gifted adults employed by rigid and formal organizational settings have found. I can only envision one exception to when the gifted mind does not suffer in a strictly formal and often contradictory setting, namely when a gifted individual is subject to a more or less psychopathic disposition. Individuals with such a personality tend to be daring, charming, highly intelligent, visionaries, and risk-takers, often with no moral compass, and have little or no empathy. Or to put it like Kevin Dutton of Oxford University, psychopaths are less morally squeamish, but only when it comes to playing for high stakes, end of quote. Well, such individuals are increasingly being seen as role models in the corporate business world. And it has been suggested by research already that they played a major part in causing the latest global financial crisis beginning in 2008. It is worth considering, perhaps, if it is in this light as well, that we need to consider the scary rich who are also the scary smart, as recently referred to in the Forbes business magazine by Jonathan Y. of Duke University. The gifted are in all likelihood able to live up to most of our expectations in theory. They are no doubt potentially phenomenal assets to any institution, nation, organization, or employer, but only if permitted to be gifted in accordance to how they actually function, and if the social context in which they work is accepting of them, supportive, and the setting is relatively free of imposing formal strictures. There is a considerable difference between what the gifted can do and what they are socially sanctioned to do. In concluding this keynote, I would also like to briefly focus on culture in reference to how we perceive giftedness and talent. In a recent issue of Gifted and Talent International, devoted to cross-cultural issues, it was concluded that addressing cultural uniqueness and its significance to gifted education is by no means novel in research and application. However, it is a fact that in spite of the available knowledge base, it has had a relatively limited impact. In view of the discussion thus far, this is not difficult to understand. Knowledge monopolies and the dogmatism that accompany them may certainly explain why, as Sternberg pointed out, gifted education has changed relatively little over a long period of time. There are at least 4 different types of human culture. Unique ethnic cultures, subcultures within these, a general culture shared by all of us, but most importantly in this context, there is also an overarching superculture. This is highly relevant, since the notions of globalization and knowledge economy constitute such an influential superculture. This supranational system of ideological and mainly neoliberal values exerts an increasing influence on what we do as researchers and educators, and also how we increasingly learn to think about giftedness and science in general. The gifted and the talented, however they are defined theoretically, are undoubtedly in the process of becoming commodities on the global market, being embraced by the superculture and its production needs rather than by native ethnic cultures. Note, for example, that there are 53, to date at least, 53 multinational corporations in the world, all with an accumulated wealth greater than 120 of the world's nations. Needless to say, these corporations will go to great lengths to acquire the talents they need for continued success. It is worth pointing out as well that researchers of the global economy and its influence on daily life actually warn that multinational corporations pose a potential threat to democracy in their sometimes relentless pursuit of growth and profit. The reason being that a large portion of control flows through a small, tight-knit core of financial and global institutions, a core termed super entity by a group of Swiss researchers at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. While with a neoliberal superculture fully developed in the form of a knowledge economy, we can expect that gifted human capital will be very appealing to every policymaker and corporate executive worldwide, with a vision of global dominance, convinced of economic growth as the model to follow. However, this is assuming that such highly desired human capital actually can be made to fit into rigid organizational structures, which I have shown in this paper is often a considerable problem. Not all countries, however, have the same inclination to embrace a knowledge economy entirely and uncritically. While Europe, and I think much of the Western world, has more or less relinquished the idea that cultural expression and age-old tradition have an intrinsic value, not necessarily profitable. India, and I think a number of other nations in Asia, Africa, and in South America, have a more balanced understanding of combining tradition and cultural expression with the notions of progress and economic development. Excuse me. Patel, for example, he is chief economic advisor to the Indian government. He urges the forces of the emerging superculture to restraint in how to understand education, in general, that is. And I quote him, "Let us not be mesmerized by the flattering notion that higher education is an investment good with productivity in economic terms, higher than most other investment. Higher education has returns which far transcend mere economic returns. These returns are the very substance of what development is all about, that is, the quality of life in its entirety, including individual dignity and self-respect and command over one's own life. These are the true hallmarks of individual freedom," end of quote. So, who does define what giftedness is? We could probably haggle over which theories and constructs are the best to define giftedness and talent for a very long time to come. But considering current global development, as well as the related increase of interest in individuals capable of more and better achievements than most others, it is quite obvious that a focus on what the gifted are able to do is much more interesting to policymakers and multinational corporations than is a focus on how such human capital assets are defined theoretically. Corporate life, the world of entertainment, the world of policy and ideologies, all tend to understand the highly able in different ways. To these, giftedness is mainly a function. To the academic world, high ability has rather been understood as a set of theoretical descriptors. Understanding giftedness as function in a societal context has, to my knowledge, in the academic world, not even been on the agenda. So the pragmatic answer to the question of who decides what giftedness is that there are a number of deciding factors. There are, of course, academic concerns, but there are also more practical concerns as defined by society with little interest in the theoretically finer points made by academics. Furthermore, within each group with vested interests in high ability are unavoidably individuals promoting and defending their own agenda for a number of reasons prompted unaware by human nature, often resulting in dogmatic attitudes and creating new knowledge monopolies. As complex as this pattern of social dynamics appears, the bottom line is that whoever has dominance, by whatever means, also ultimately reserves the right to definition. Now, this is dominance as based on social power and influence. The foundation for such dominance rests not on factual accuracy, rational logic, or empirical evidence, but on aggression in its various expressions. My conviction is that the academic world is at a crossroads. Perhaps this is true of the world in general as well. Google executives, Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen, for example, they foresee a future in which we exist in two parallel civilizations, the physical and traditional one, and the virtual one. Other thinkers and researchers speak of a new world order. However, as Oxford University's Future of Humanity Institute has pointed out, while we are quite literally going where no man has gone before, we do so in incredible haste, characterized by little understanding of moral responsibility, and in the wake of a global economy we see mainly motivated by corporate growth and gain, aided and sustained by information technology, which we are increasingly allowing to operate without human control. At least I find it deeply disconcerting that the world is so obsessed by technological progress and prowess, and that education systems worldwide are made to serve this development uncritically. While equal importance is not given to moral responsibility, individual concern, and unique cultural expression. It is also somewhat worrisome that high ability is viewed as a commodity and is increasingly becoming a key issue in policies embracing global development towards the knowledge economy. There is already a war for talents in full operation. I do think there are choices to be made for us in regard to how we wish our futures to look like. But do we as scholars and educators have the mindset of the gifted and the talented? Are we risk takers with a desire to shake things up in spite of the cost? Do we have the desire to set things straight, to alter the status quo, and question established tradition, challenging current knowledge monopolies? We do need the gifted and talented, I think, in our day and time, more than ever. And I think, to the extent that it is possible, we need to be more like the gifted at heart. Thank you very much.